Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Crisis to Recovery. I'm delighted to see so many familiar names and also some unfamiliar ones from people all over the world. Great to see on the chat where you're based and where you're zooming in from. Hello, my name's Susan Goldsworthy. I'm affiliate faculty of Leadership and Organizational Change at IMD. It's my pleasure and privilege to work with Shlomo on our CLEAR program, which is IMD's senior flagship program. I'll be facilitating this session, and so what I'm going to ask you is to send in your questions on the Q&A, and then I'll be monitoring it and asking Shlomo some of those as we go through. As you note, the meeting is recorded, and you will be able to view the webinar afterwards and potentially share it with other team members, and we'll also share more about that at the end. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Shlomo Ben-Hur, who is Professor of Leadership and Organizational Behavior at IMD. Prior to IMD, he actually worked in business, like many of you, and he spent 20 years working at companies like BP, Daimler, and Sloan Kettering. He's co-author of several books that are based on in-depth research. And again, what I'm excited about today's webinar is it is based on some of his most recent research with his colleague Nick Kingley. That's the professional side of Shlomo. On the personal side, as I say, I'm privileged to work with him. I'm actually broadcasting from his office because the light's better in his office than mine, so I feel even more connected with Shlomo. Shlomo's in one of our conference rooms so that he can deliver this to you from there. But I've come to know Shlomo as a compassionate, generous, and curious person who really makes a difference in this world. So an absolute pleasure to introduce Shlomo.
Thank you for this kind introduction, Susan. It's an ongoing honor to be directing the CLEAR program with you, and I'm delighted that you were able to join us this morning. Good morning, everybody from Lausanne. Delighted to be here. This has been a challenging time for all of us. I mean, it's been challenging on so many levels. I mean, if I'm thinking about the geopolitical level, I mean, I'm thinking about the societal level, organizational level, leadership levels, but really what Susan and I focus on in our work, I mean, is mainly the organizational level and the individual leadership level, which is what I would like to focus on today. And if you're looking at sort of like what's been happening in comparison to sort of like the historical context that we're in, I'm thinking about my days in which I spent growing up in the Middle East, where crisis was sort of like commonplace, or living in New York during the burst of the dot-com bubble. I'm thinking about my life in London, where I was experiencing the 2008-9 financial crisis and many others in between. This has been remarkably different. I mean, just the very fact that we're all part of this. But really, if you're looking at all different measures, so if we can start the presentation now, you can see that one of the measures that I'm looking at is the VIX, which was the the Chicago Exchange measure for sort of like the economical situation. And that usually sort of like lingers at around 15 to 20. And on 16th of March this year, that was at 82.69. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, this is a level it has never reached. I mean, even during the financial crisis in 2008, it was lower than this. And what is also very interesting, I mean, actually quite fascinating to look at, is the fact that for a month and a half, almost 2 months, it continued to linger at that level of 35 to 50. So this has been quite a traumatic experience for all of us, for every one of us. And we're actually now sort of like venturing into sort of like rehabilitating our organizations, our economy, our lives, but we're in a post-traumatic stage. We really are experiencing post-trauma.
Thanks, Shlomo. And so what we're going to be looking at in this presentation is what we call the power of three. So at first we're going to look, Shlomo's going to share 3 facts that they've actually seen from previous crises. So what have been learned from looking at previous crises? And then what are the business behaviors that were exhibited by organizations that actually won through those crises, that came out stronger than they were before. And then most of today's webinar is going to focus on the 3 leadership factors that make a difference. And this is very much from his recent research into leadership behaviors that make a difference to sustain the recovery. And so with that, I'll hand back to Shlomo.
Yeah, so just kind of like when we all went into almost quarantine. I mean, luckily in Switzerland, we didn't have quite a quarantine, but we were all in our houses and sort of like closing in. Both my dear colleague and friend, Nick Kinley, who lives in London, and myself have been exchanging emails. I mean, it started Zoom discussions about what's been happening, I mean, historically in these kind of like times of crisis. So when we were in our private quarters, I mean, we were reading lots of articles, lots of reports about what was shaping recovery. I mean, and what is interesting is that if you look at all of this research, and there's a sea of research out there, there's 3 facts that are quite interesting. I mean, they're pretty straightforward, but still worthwhile to look at. The first one, which is not going to be a surprise to anyone, is that there will be winners and there will be losers of this. In fact, this morning I was talking to a CEO that I work with, who is one of those winners. I mean, coming out of this recession, out of this crisis. And on the other hand, I mean, we see a very large group of organizations that are falling into other categories. So when we looked at studies, I mean, of 4,700 public companies in the United States recessions, we see that 76%, I mean, almost 3/4, struggled but survived. I mean, so they came out on the other side of this, but they really suffered substantially. 17% fared very badly. I mean, so these are companies that declared bankruptcy or were acquired by others. And then there's around 10% that actually have seen very good performance. They actually thrived as a result of those crises. They came out with an increase of more than 10% in sales and profit growth. When we looked at studies around the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, again, you saw very similar numbers. And the top 10% of the companies saw a major improvement in their earnings throughout the crisis and after the crisis, where 3/4 were struggling with that. So when we look at the second part, what a lot of investigations were focusing on were trying to compare the companies before the crisis and then how they were coming out of the crisis. And this is where a lot of economists were examining a lot of structural differences between the companies. They were trying to predict and find high correlations between where they were before and how they ended up. And what we saw are quite surprising results, which I think are important to highlight for many of us that are kind of looking at our own organizations, thinking about how are we going to fare out. One thing that we discovered is that size is not a great predictor. It is true that for small companies, there's a higher level of vulnerability, but it's mainly around not having enough cash at times. But on the other hand, they're much less likely to have large debts. And that actually saves some of these organizations in comparison to the other big ones. And they're also more nimble. So in many cases, what you would have expected did not quite happen. When you look at pre-crisis performance, which was another indicator that we were looking at, there was no reliable indicator in the pre-performance of a company. And what we saw is that 85% of the companies were market leaders in their segment, in their specific industry, before the crisis, actually ended up suffering greatly as a result of that. So as we were looking, and as researchers were looking at factors that were affecting recovery, I mean, they were looking at the number of years that the company has been in existence, the sector they were operating on, the financial condition that they had before the crisis. There was no high correlation that was really supporting the predictions of how they're going to fare out coming out of the crisis. What we did discover, and what a lot of researchers discovered when they were looking at that, is that it was the performance of the leaders. It was decisions that were made. It was the actions that were taken by the management that actually made the difference. And as we were looking at that...
If I could just interrupt there, we had a question. How did the current VIX compare to those in the Great Depression and the financial crisis?
So it's always... The financial crisis was actually at 80, which was the highest that we've had in history. and the VIX in this crisis actually reached almost 83. So close to the financial crisis, but still so like above that. And this was the highest that we've ever seen in the history. So if I go back to the business behaviors that are seen more frequently in recovery winners, this is sort of like not just my compulsion as a business school professor to end up with 3, but we actually sort of like investigated this phenomena. And Nick and I kind of like both ended up with these 3 because they seem to emerge, I mean, from all of those studies. And the 3 are efficiency, evolution, and the last one is empowerment. So these are our 3 E's here. And I want to double click on each one of those to see whether you think you're doing well on all of those 3, which we find to be important to actually have a mix of those as you're trying to push your way into winning out of this crisis. So when it comes to efficiency, it's very clear that all leaders, I mean, in all organizations, have immediately started focusing on cash flow and cost management. I mean, this is something that is critical. You need to do this as a leader. You need to really make sure that you are focusing on sort of like reducing your cost and planning to come out of this in a positive kind of a way. But the interesting thing that we found is that the winners are not those that are using sort of like very harsh cost reduction measures across the board. Many of them, of those winners, of the 10%, have actually used the crisis to make the business more fit. So it's actually the focus on fitness that we see as the differentiator. One interesting example was the different strategies that Office Depot in the United States took versus Staples. I mean, these were the arch rivals for many years. And during the crisis, what we have seen is that Office Depot cut personnel and cost across the board by 10%. 10% of the personnel was cut from the entire organization within like weeks from the financial crisis. What was interesting to see is that Staples looked at sort of like its fitness, and what they decided is to close all of the stores that were not operating very profitably. But interestingly enough, they actually increased their staff by 10% in order to focus on high-end products and so like higher customer intimacy. And they spent more on advertising there. So firms that are improving operational efficiency seem to fare better than those that just focus on staff costs. And here I want you to start thinking about like, where are you? Kind of like, what measures are you taking? And are you being discriminant about this? Are you being more nuanced, or are you just cutting costs across the board? The second one is evolution. And we use the word evolution in order to make sure that we're talking about evolution and not innovation. Many think, and we thought going into this, that you really need to start innovating. But it's not about blue sky kind of like thinking. What we see when we're looking at the winners is that those were companies that evolved their products, kind of like thinking about the products that they have and what kind of like tweaks they need to implement to kind of like adjust them to the new conditions, to the new situation. It's about evolving your services. And it's also about evolving your distribution channels that are always being challenged, I mean, in these kind of crises. The top 10% of those who came out as winners out of the crisis invested more than their rivals in 2 areas, in their R&D and in their marketing. And there were plenty of examples for that. I mean, one interesting example is Sanofi, the multinational French-based pharma company that moved their investment in R&D during the financial crisis from 970 million to 1.3 billion. In order to develop more products, to adjust and to evolve their products. And you could see that in the upswing coming out of the crisis in 2004, they acquired Aventis. That would probably not have happened had they not gone this way of evolution. A very interesting one from the Great Depression, which is sort of like the 1920s in the US, was sort of like how the cereal companies battled or dealt with the Great Depression. You know, that at that point, cereal was not sort of like commonplace. It was still sort of like just a nascent industry in the United States. And the 2 big players were Post and Kellogg. And when the financial crisis hit, Post really decreased all of their expenses, cut every advertising cost that they have had, and they tried to sort of like really hunker down. On the other hand, what we've seen with Kellogg is that they've actually increased their advertising. I mean, they went with the blitz on radio advertising that was very new at that point, and they evolved their products. They introduced Rice Krispies and Pops, and their sales increased by 30% during the crisis. And so like in the many years coming out of the crisis, and until today, they are the market leader in their segment. So one last thing that I would mention is that there is evidence also from this research that all of the recession drive new technology. You're probably experiencing this. I'm certainly experiencing this together with Susan and all of our faculty colleagues here at IMD, where we have been Zooming nonstop, to connect with our participants, to connect with all of you that are usually people who would come on our campus. And we have really made the changes within these 3 months that we probably would have needed, I don't know, maybe 10 years. Had the situation been remaining normal or how it was before. So adopting technology costs much less during a recession than it is in normal operating sort of like life, partially because of the opportunity cost. It doesn't cost us as much because we have more availability. So this is about the second one, the evolution. And I suggest that you start thinking about the degree to which you're actually evolving your products and services, evolving your distribution channels, and where it is that you're making investments. And then last but not least is the third E, which is empowerment. And this is actually quite counterintuitive because what is interesting is that what we see when we're looking at companies in crisis is that the value of local information increases in bad times. This is where you want to be as close to the action as possible, as close to your customers as possible, as close to your partners as you can. But there's also a very natural, a very human instinct that leaders experience, which is to take control. We see that there's a crisis, we see that things are not going well, and we want to move in and to kind of go and slay the dragons and address all of the challenges that we have. And what we're seeing is that what is important is that you might make sure as a leader or as a leadership team that you focus, that the organization aligns around clear boundaries that you're establishing. But what we also see is the counter side of that what helps winning is when you decentralize, when you enable decisions to happen at the local level, when you're enabling the organization to actually respond to your customers in the fastest way possible. So decentralization only works if people feel empowered. That's why we're highlighting this empowerment aspect here to say you need structurally to make sure that you are empowering people at the front lines, at the different business units and the different parts of your global operations. But it's also the psychology of empowerment, allowing people to make sure that they feel that they are respected, that they feel that they're empowered to do what needs to be done. And obviously, you need to ensure that the communication flows upward in the organization. So this is kind of like the three. It's efficiency, evolution, and empowerment.
So this is a wonderful time to ask a few questions which are coming in. So let me share these with you. So the first one is that the focus seems to be responding to the unexpected surprise. How can we prepare for expected surprises like the pandemic and scenarios, things like that?
So I think it's more of the same in many ways, because when we're looking at these three characteristics, they're true for the time of crisis, but certainly true when you're trying to think about like the crises that are going to come our way. And we know based on everything that this is going to be sort of like the new normal, where we might be subject to these things on an ongoing basis. And therefore, a mindset of efficiency, of evolution, of empowerment is going to be very critical.
Thanks, Shlomo. Another question, can you explain what change you've seen for pricing methods on your evolution side? Could you expand on that a little bit?
So the pricing, we have certainly seen in the evolution that there's a fair amount of companies that are starting to look at sort of like, how do we adjust our pricing to the different products? So this is what Staples did, right? That's why they were able to hire 10% more people, because they said, this is high end. we're going to be much more catering to that part of the clientele. So here we can increase prices. But on the other hand, I mean, if you are evolving your distribution channels, I mean, if you are really doing things that are more mass produced or less intimate in nature, you could really decrease prices. So you really need to adjust those as you go.
Yeah, so a question kind of linking to that insights from the three seem to be applicable all times, not just during crisis. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A question on how do you see the crisis affecting income inequality?
Oh, I think that's a broader issue, and I think we're all witnessing this, right? I mean, we're all witnessing this at the beginning with horror as we were looking at the number of unemployed people, so like getting to the unemployment offices or just losing their jobs. And we're seeing some organizations on the other side who are really kind of like succeeding and able to really not just weather the storm, but come out as winners. And I think we will see more of this coming out of the crisis. We will see some that are going to be the players of the future who are able to hire more people with the right skills, especially with the right technological skills. I mean, that's one of the things that we have seen, that people with sort of like high technology skills are really needed coming out of these kind of crises because of the improvement on the technological side. And we will see people who would suffer greatly from that. And I think this is a broader question for us as a society and to the governmental leaders in the world to think about how do you balance those things? I mean, how do you really reduce the tension that we see accumulating?
Yeah, and actually there's an interesting couple of questions I could combine here. What's the right balance between the three E's, as they're not always alignable? And is there a priority order? What's the top priority and why?
So it's interesting. I think that's very, very specific to this specific business, specific industry, also to the specific culture, because there's different cultures that might implement different measures, I mean, at different times. But what we see is that you need to make a cocktail of those three. You need to really assess the scenario that you're working with. And this is a lot of what we've been doing with IMD in the last 3 months. I mean, we're working with different organizations to look at where are they, who are going to be the winners, I mean, in their environment, who are going to be some of the organizations that would struggle, where are they in terms of culture, in terms of organizational culture and national culture, in terms of their ability to focus on efficiency, to convey empowerment measures, and really make sure that they're evolving their products.
I'm going to ask everyone I'm going to open a poll. I'm going to ask people if they could now vote, because we're interested to see in your companies, which do you see your company currently focusing the least on? And so you can see the poll is now open. If you could vote for which one your business is focusing the least on. And at the moment, it seems to be, it's going up and down, but empowerment is the one that seems to be the least. And efficiency seems to be the most out of, if you look at the three. If you're saying, which of them were least, efficiency comes out the lowest score. Empowerment is the highest score, which I guess in some ways is no surprise, Shlomo, because what we're seeing probably is a lot of organizations starting, and governments even, to take control. Right. And so that was actually linked to another question, which is, how does that reverse? How do you, if people are taking more control in order to drive efficiency, how do you then get the empowerment happening?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, this is not surprising, Susan. And we talked about this as we were looking at the research together. I mean, as we were preparing this, I mean, and this is really kind of like where our expectation was. So I feel like this is a good, but also to some degree, an unfortunate confirmation of where we were thinking organizations are in some ways. We understand this. I mean, at this moment in time, I mean, this is kind of like natural. But I think we need to realize as leaders, as we're leading organizations, is that ultimately we would like the organizations to take the measures that are needed, both on the evolution and the efficiency, through their own initiative. And for organization to be able to do that, you need to empower your people. You need to give them a sense of structural empowerment, of individual empowerment, psychological empowerment. So the natural tendency is, especially in this phase that we're in, after some organizations were very empowering at the beginning and trying to provide support and trust to their employees, to go into this nervous stage in which we're starting to kind of like dominate things. I mean, through the efficiency measures, through the cuts. But we actually need to sort of like really worry about the balance of making people feel heard, of making people feel that they're actually able to make a difference to their customers, to their lines of business. And as we go through all of this, what we want is to really just remind all of you that these 3 E's really matter, that they're important. Susan, did you have any more comments here, or?
We've got lots of questions, but I think if you carry on, we can come back to them. So there's lots.
Okay. So I would just say that knowing what to do is one thing, right? I mean, but really where Susan and I spend our lives is on the second part of that equation. It's about knowing how to do it, because that's quite a different thing. I mean, and we see a lot of leaders who are very, very clear in articulating what it is that needs to be done. But then we look at the how, we see some of them that are quite struggling with that. I mean, so we wanted to focus the rest of our discussion more on the how. I mean, this is near and dear to our hearts, but it's also sort of like very, very closely connected with how you are able to drive these kind of behaviors. So we see that almost half of you, I mean, 50% of you or your organizations are focusing the least on empowerment. And that's partially why it's really like important that we try to think about the entire cocktail, about all of the 3 E's as you're trying to drive that recovery. So when we were looking at leaders and the how of leaders, there's lots of examples that we were looking at. I mean, in terms of leaders, I mean, in industries, I mean, leaders in political sphere. And one that I really found important, I mean, to get into that discussion of the how is the one of Governor Cuomo in New York. I mean, after sort of like the horrible situation that was in New York, when things were getting better and he was sort of like starting to look more composed, I mean, and okay in the media, he said, credit needs to go to all New Yorkers, all Americans. They flattened the curve, nobody else, no government agency, no public health expert. It's the people's action that flattened the curve. And I think that's a very important message for us as leaders, I mean, in the situation, to say, it's not the leader that makes it happen. It's the people. It's the people who are working in your organization who are going to make the difference to their customers, to the kind of product, to the recovery. And the leader is the one that needs to allow that recovery to sustain itself by really focusing on the how. And the way that they would focus on the how is not by how they themselves would drive efficiency and evolution and empowerment, but it's how would they create the environment in which the people and the business would be able to do those kind of things. And the environment, or sort of like this operating system, as Nick and I call it, is the key lever that you have as a leader to make sure that things happen when you are out of the room, when people are out in the field, when they're trying to address what it is that's going on in the market. And Nick and I spent the last 3 years focusing on what it is that constitutes a leadership operating system. It's research that we've published just in December in a new book that came out that focuses on our learnings from 50 years of research that started in the most boring topic. I mean, you really can't find more boring articles than that are called vertical diet linkage theory. Could you imagine that? I mean, how many of you would read this? And so we actually ventured into trying to read this because we felt that there was a lot of good stuff in some of those articles. It, with time, morphed into leader-member exchange theory. And those were studies that were looking at how relationship between leaders and their direct reports, leaders and their customers, leaders and their peers and their key stakeholders were impacting the operating systems that was actually sort of like leading to the performance of organizations. And we looked at measures of performance and the measures of those operating systems that were being created. And coming out of that research, we were able, with the model that we created, to empirically try it out with a 360 assessment that we have used for 2,500 leaders. We have actually started using that on our CLEAR program, and we've been looking at the results of those. And what seems to emerge from that is that when you're looking at the leadership operating system that a leader creates, there's three factors that sort of like come head and shoulders above everything else. And those are trust, not a big surprise, but it's fascinating to see how clearly that came out of the research, really above anything else. The second is clarity. Again, not surprising, but we'll get in a moment to double click on this and to see the specific elements of that. And then last but not least is an element that was the hardest for us to name as a factor, because it was an aggregation of a number of factors that had a very high correlations between them, and we called it momentum. So I want to go into each of those and then come back to sort of like look at your organization and have you think a little bit about like where you stand with all of those. So I think it would go without surprising you to say that trust was the number one by far. It's the single most important element of successful operating systems. This is what you want to have in your organization, not only during a time of crisis, but throughout sort of like the life of the organization. This is what will be the driver to individual performance, to team performance, and to all of your measures of performance in general. It's actually interesting because people reported that trust is more important to them in terms of doing a good job and delivering performance on performance measures than how much they enjoy their work. I mean, this was almost like something that we couldn't even hypothesize, but it came out very clearly from the research. And what is interesting about trust is that trust could be lost very, very quickly, but it takes a while to gain. And one of the more difficult things that you have as a leader is when you need to reestablish trust, when you need to reestablish that with your employees, with your customers, with your partners. And one example of a leader that I thought was doing a very interesting and good job in reestablishing trust is the leader of Zoom, is Eric. Some of you know that Zoom is sort of like skyrocketed, during this crisis. We have all started using Zooms. In fact, I've been using Zoom every day on my job, since the crisis started. I've used it. We're a Jewish family and we are spread all over the world. And during the crisis, we had Passover Seder, which is a very important holiday for us. And we had a Zoom family dinner for Passover Seder with 14 different windows in which anybody from my older mother who was quarantined in her house to our children, that one was in Spain, actually in a lockdown in Spain, and the other one was in California. And all of the other cousins and sisters and brothers, in between, we were all on Zoom. And then a few days later, all of the titles and the headlines in the newspapers were about all of the problems that Zoom was having. A lot of security issues that people were troubled with. And companies started withdrawing from utilizing Zoom. And the CEO of Zoom came out on all of the public televisions and spoke there about what it is that Zoom was doing. And I want to play this video to you of just less than 1 minute. It's not going to be very clear probably because this was a Zoom communication that was on national TV, that was then on the internet, and I clipped it from there. But I want you to listen to him and just to his words and see how he goes about reestablishing trust.
I think you're right. Our service was built to serve business and a lot of enterprise customers. However, during this COVID-19 crisis, we moved too fast. Our intention to serve the end users, serve the K-12 schools. However, we had some missteps. We should have done something to enforce password and waiting room and double check every server settings. But over the past 1 week and 2 weeks, we also took actions to fix those missteps. Because the new user case is very different to our traditional business and enterprise customers.
So I hope you were able to hear some of this. And what is interesting is that Eric reestablished trust. And he does this very, very quickly by taking ownership of the missteps. He actually apologizes. He said, this was just way too big for us. It all happened overnight. And then there was rapid implementation of customer-focused responses. From the end-to-end encryption to the password solutions that they created to the new security settings. And we have experienced that at IMD because some of our clients, were sort of like using Zoom to communicate with us. For the teaching and the sessions that we were delivering, were challenging that or asking about the platforms. And we were able to connect them with the Zoom managers in their respective areas who were able to implement and talk about these steps that we're taking right away. So when we look at trust, what we see in our study is that it starts with care. It's actually the ability to demonstrate care, to treat people with respect. It's then very much about psychological safety, about creating safety in the organization where people feel safe to voice their ideas, to take risks, to make mistakes also. And it's about reliability and consistency in terms of your behavior as a leadership team. And it's very much about fairness. So these are the four elements that had very high correlations between them into what it is that we call trust here. When we move from trust to the second element, that has to do with clarity. And clarity is the understanding that exists in the organization about the strategy of the business, the key roles, who is accountable for things, how things should get done. And this is probably the most challenging thing in a crisis like this, because suddenly your strategy is out of the window, right? And the feeling is that we can't really offer clarity. I mean, it's actually quite a bleak screen we're looking at. But in spite of that, what we see in organizations that were winning in crisis is that they're creating the essential alignment and unity that is critical for the business to function through clarifying what it is that is clear. So maybe a lot of things are not clear, but there are some things that are clear. There are some things that you do know you could push as key pillars of what the new normal is for your organization. And this is what you really need to do. And as we were observing different leaders across the world, one of them that came to sort of be an interesting example for me as I was thinking about clarity and the way we go about defining it is Hans Westerberg, who is the CEO of Verizon. Now, as you could imagine, I mean, Verizon was and still is the platform that a huge amount of many, many millions in North America are using to connect on Zoom, to connect and to keep their business going. And they experience this huge change, I mean, in the utilization level overnight. And this was an interview with him when the crisis was at its peak in many ways, reacting and responding and giving some measures of where he stands on providing clarity to his organization and to the world. So let's, again, try to tolerate the fact that this is a recording of a recording of a recording, but try to listen to the key messages that he's communicating.
I think that what I'm doing, I mean, we have our noon live webcast, 40 to 50,000 people or employees is attending. It's actually external, so anybody can see it. We have nothing to hide. But what we want to do, we want to reassure that the most important for us is safe and healthy for our employees, as well as we want to share with them the important work they're doing to keeping up one of the most important infrastructures there is at these times, and that's, of course, the networks. So we want to reassure them that both the situation and that we want to take care of our employees, and secondly about what we're doing for customers. And then we talk about that. We bring in different leaders talking about that. That's what we want to do. Ultimately, communication is the key. We receive hundreds of questions every day based on that. So we know that our employees have still questions that are more individual. But we spur that type of transparency because in these times, you cannot communicate enough, and that's why we do it.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, he's sitting with his T-shirt, in his closed room, probably in his house, and he's trying to create clarity. I mean, I don't envy him. I mean, this is something that you must have experienced. I mean, many of you who are participating in this call. And I would say, this is tough stuff. You are sitting there, you are in many ways disconnected, but you need to provide that connection. You need to provide that glue for the organization. And he's done that through transparency, through communication. He's talking every day at noon to 135,000 employees. So those people have some clarity. They know that at noon today, or whatever it is in their time zone, there's going to be a webcast with the CEO. He's highlighting the new rules and the guidelines. He has 1 hour leadership team meeting every day. So the leaders who need to provide this clarity and cascade it in the organization know that this is what's going on. And he's doing that with the board. He's doing it with the 45 most critical customers in his business. If you listen to that on YouTube, you will hear even more than what you heard in this very short video that I provided here about how he struggled with this issue, but actually was able to provide clarity. So when we look at clarity, it's about direction, and direction, no matter what time you are using this sort of like vehicle to strengthen your operating system, is critical. It's about the purpose, it's about accountability, and it's very much about the values that you want to carry throughout the crisis and coming out of it. These are not the posters that are on the walls in your headquarters. It's the values that you practice and consistently display as a leadership team, as top executives to your organization. And I want to move to the third and last component of these operating system characteristics. So we talked about trust, we talked about clarity, and the third one, which was the most challenging, and this was like a jello ball, that Nick and I kept trying to sort of like define, and it kept escaping us all the time until we came up with this word, and I hope that it speaks to something that you could relate to, and we call it momentum. Momentum is the energy for sustained activity. It comes from motivation, it comes from confidence, it comes from that empowerment that we spoke earlier about, and from a sense of community, of togetherness. What is important about momentum is that it generates the drive. That when you're looking at the workforce, this is what keeps people working harder and persisting longer. It increases their loyalty to the organization. And this is what is the best predictor for levels of creativity and entrepreneurship that actually takes place. And when we were looking at that specifically, in the crisis, in sort of like organizations that we looked at in crisis situation, that's when a lot of toxins actually emerge. This is where there's a lot of stress. This is where some people would tend to sort of like obsess around details. When they start anchoring in their own silos, definitely we see that, with this pandemic, when people are dispersed, they're in different contexts, they're not meeting each other face to face. And what is most critical in these days is that momentum, is the ability to generate drive and to counter these toxins. So it's a multi-factor sort of like set of elements, but we see very clearly organizations that are able to drive momentum and drive performance through driving momentum. One such example from the financial downturn, as we were studying different leaders and organizations, was the DTE. This is a business in the utility sector in the United States, based in Michigan. And during the financial crisis, they hit rock bottom in many ways. And this was a moment of truth for Jerry Anderson, who was the CEO there after they've lost $200 million in revenues in 2008. And what he did is that he did a video that he broadcasted to all 10,000 employees in the organization, in which he did not promise them that there wouldn't be layoffs and that he wouldn't cut staff, but he told them that this would be the last thing that they will do. He said, in return, what I'm expecting from you, my fellow DTE employees, is that you bring your energy, your focus and intensity to your work like we never did before. He said, we want to kick ass here. We really want to go for this in the best and most creative way we could. And what was fascinating is to see that within weeks, not even months, within weeks, employees came up with so many innovative solutions that tried to solve problems from the very large issues to the small issues that translated into major cost savings, major efficiency measures, and improved profitability. So when the crisis devastated most of the United States economy, they actually did better than anybody expected and better than other players in their segment. And where the state of Michigan fired 340,000 people who lost their jobs, none of the 10,000 people in DTE lost it. So when we look at momentum, it's about motivation, it's about building confidence in your people, it's about empower them, the very issue that we talked about. And it's about making sure that there's an ongoing connection, so like ongoing glue that brings us together as a community. So with that, I want to conclude and to say trust, clarity, and momentum are critical for success. They don't solve all of your challenges as a leader when you're looking at sort of like correlations with performance, but they're able to explain around 75% of what it is that affects performance. And high-performing leaders are high on all of those three. So you can't just say, I'm doing trust, and then I don't really focus on the other one. You actually need to really make sure that there's a good mix, because acting in this way that you intend to be motivational is one thing, but actually creating the operating system in which people feel motivated, in which people drive the business and produce the results, is another thing. It's the difference between intending to be successful and actually being so.
Shlomo, I'm going to come in here because we've got a stream of questions coming in. And one suggestion which I think we can look at is, could we answer some of these afterwards? We won't have time to answer all of them in this webinar, but certainly we can look at them and answer after. Let me just bring a few to you. How do we convince our leaders that the 4 dimensions of trust are the most important to keep in mind, given that this seems to be the hardest for many leaders? This is one of the questions.
I think it's actually funny because it's a tough one, but on the other one, it's an easy one, because intuitively, if you talk to people, they all say, this is the most important thing for us. I want you to trust me, and then I will trust you, and then we will have a trust in the system that would allow us to take risks, that would allow us to speak openly about what's going on, that would allow us to challenge each other. So in many ways, you just need to take a deep breath and to kind of like think about what it is that people want and how it is that you could provide that.
And linking to that, there's a question around, do millennials and Gen Z hold trust at the same importance level?
So for the millennials, I mean, we see very clearly that trust and empowerments are both very, very important. But you know what? I think that we're overdoing this, focusing on the millennials. If I'm a 57-year-old guy, actually, no, I just turned 58. I mean, it was days ago. I'm still getting used to that. But I want you to trust me. I want the president of IMD to trust me. I want to know that when we are moving into this new world in which we're Zooming for hours in our own isolated places instead of interacting with participants in the room, that we could trust each other, that I could trust my IT who is supporting me in delivering this. This makes all of us feel better and feel more committed to the message that is hopefully clear and to the momentum that we want to create.
Building again on the trust, that clearly resonated with a lot of people. There's a question around gender in the leadership teams that performed well. Your trust slide presents the classic stereotype of a woman's leadership style. Do you find it interesting to see hard-charging male leaders trying to adopt this style?
Well, I think, Susan, you know me very well. I mean, so this is getting into sort of like our previous discussions. I mean, I always believe that feminine qualities are very, very useful. I mean, in fact, in a moment, I'm going to share with you an example of a female leader that I've been following, I mean, very religiously in the last months. So I would say, yes, you could say that women are higher on levels of empathy, right? I mean, if we're looking at our research, I mean, we see that women are able to convey empathy better than men. But it doesn't mean that men are not able to do this. They just need to realize and believe that it's important, and they need to stretch themselves to the degree that they're able to display that. And again, when we talk about operating system, it's not just about the one leader, right? I mean, so if in your leadership team, you have these, and now I'm not talking about gender, I'm not talking about women and men, I'm talking about female qualities versus male qualities. If you have more of those in your leadership team, in your entire leadership population, you will be able to display that, even if the leader at the top is more of sort of like a more masculine characteristic, kind of like a leader.
How easy or hard is it to create trust in a post-COVID world?
I think it's tough. I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, I see my up days and low days, I mean, as we are sort of like experiencing this, to say in this ambiguous situation in which everything is being questioned, is being challenged, is being revised, it is more difficult. But I genuinely believe that if you start with care, if you go into creating psychological safety, there's a tremendous amount of trust that gets created.
And so we have a question on momentum. linked to confinement, right? How can you drive momentum in the current circumstances that we're dealing with?
In very simple measures. I mean, and I'm thinking about sort of like the best example for me is IMD right now, right? Because we're busy talking to you about what it is that you might need to be doing, but we have been in this situation ourselves. And I have to say, I mean, this is where I give a tremendous amount of credit to our president, Jean-François Manzoni, and to the leadership team of IMD for having been able to keep the momentum going during this time in which we, as faculty and as staff, are spread all over the world, not just sort of like in Switzerland, but we're all over the world. And we are able to create motivation, and the leadership team has been able to create that momentum and motivation through anything from very serious things that they were engaged in. I mean, in terms of sharing the situation with us, in terms of really making sure that the communication is on an ongoing basis, through getting us trained in utilizing Zoom and other technology vehicles, and through funny things like videos of what we're all about as a community, through celebrating things virtually with each other, through having a hotline in which we're sharing the IMD spirit. Those are quite simple things, but they go a very long way.
Absolutely. There's a question around similarities between successful businesses and leadership and winning sports teams. What's your thoughts on what business people can learn from sports coaches?
Oh, that could take us for a whole hour discussion. And I think a better person to speak about this is you, Susan. Because for those of you who don't know Susan, I mean, Susan, aside from being an extremely inspiring professor at IMD, she's also an ex-Olympian, having been in the Olympics as a swimmer. So should you answer this? I mean, maybe you could say a word about that.
Well, thank you, Shlomo. I think just to say absolutely, because very much it's around how to get people to fulfill their potential. And what was lovely was also a question earlier about, is the style needed by managers more of a coaching style now? And if you think about the actualizing tendency, which is all living organisms to have the inbuilt motivation to fulfill their potential, but it's the conditions they find themselves in that enable that potential to be fulfilled. I think that leads beautifully to sports, but also to the research of trust, clarity, and momentum, right? It's creating the conditions where others can fulfill and be empowered to fulfill their potential. So linking back to that.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Susan. Maybe I could jump to that female leader that I wanted to share, so like a short video of with the group. And this is a leader that I've been observing from the beginning. I mean, it was very interesting to see that at the beginning of her leadership, people were challenging whether she is the right person after her predecessor, whether she will be able to do this, being such a young leader actually in the world stage. And she actually just gave birth right before the crisis. And there was some criticism about like maybe we're getting a 50% world leader, I mean, to lead our country. And this is Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. And I've been observing this leader consistently just because I found that her ability to actually create the trust, to deliver clarity, and to bring momentum and drive momentum in her operating system of a whole country, for that matter, was quite fascinating. So again, I'm going to ask you to bear with maybe the quality of the video, but to listen just for less than a minute again to this leader very early in this crisis, trying to bring an operating system to its high possibilities.
I'm speaking directly to all New Zealanders today to give you as much certainty and clarity as we can as we fight COVID-19. Over the past few weeks, the world has changed, and it has changed very quickly. In February, it would have seemed unimaginable to close New Zealand's borders to the world, and now it has been an obvious step as we fight COVID-19. This is because we are experiencing an unprecedented event, a global pandemic that in New Zealand we have moved to fight by going hard and going early. I understand that all of this rapid change creates anxiety and uncertainty, especially when it means changing how we live. That's why today I'm going to set out for you as clearly as possible what you can expect as we continue to fight the virus together.
Yeah, so she's infusing trust by displaying care, by displaying compassion, reliability, and honesty. I mean, she talks about the sacrifices that will come. I mean, she's not trying to glorify this. She's offering clarity by setting an explicit step system that became sort of like the hallmark of the New Zealand approach to all of this. And she's driving momentum through connection, through empowerment, through building that feeling of unity against COVID-19, through building the pride of New Zealanders that are saying we're not just flattening the curve, we're squashing it. So maybe, yeah, that's just an example to keep in mind.
Thanks, Shlomo. There's a number of questions coming through around this aspect of moving to trust, moving to care, moving to creating psychological safety is a real challenge for many leaders in today's world where facts and figures may dominate. And so what advice do you give to organizations? How can they make this shift and how can they understand the importance of it?
I think it starts by just recognizing the important difference between, so like me and as a leader in my qualities versus me as a leader in charge of an operating system that needs to drive these qualities. So it's first of all a humbling message to leaders to say, it's not about you, it's about the system that gets created. And your role, which is where it is about you, is to make sure that this system is optimized. And it could be optimized through these three characteristics, three elements that have emerged above all others in a very detailed research. And believe me, this was quite a detailed research of hundreds and hundreds of articles, of looking at leaders in different situations, of comparing performance to these measures of operating system. So I think we're almost running out of time.
Yes, so let me just share. We have some questions that we encourage you to reflect on for yourselves and for your own learning. Learning starts with us and change starts with us. And so what we encourage you to think about after the webinar are, what factors do you think your own leadership operating system is strong and where could it do with improving? What for you is the most difficult factor to put into your operating system, your environment, given your business context? From many of the questions, it seems like the trust one is very much that case. And how confident are you that your direct reports, peers, bosses would agree with that characterization? So as we ask you to reflect after this, I'd like to thank the more than 400 people that have joined this webinar. It's been wonderful. I wish we could go on longer because it's a fascinating topic. As I say, there's many questions we haven't been able to answer. We will see if we can capture those and answer those afterwards and share them with you. Also, just to say, I mentioned the recording will be available, that you can use this with your teams and maybe encourage you to have that dialogue with your teams. Where are we on these three elements of trust, clarity, momentum, and on the four subsets of each of them? You could even do a sort of a mini check on that. There is a 360 that Nick and Shlomo have created on this, but you could even do a sort of spot check with each other. Keep that dialogue going, get that openness. And also I shared at the beginning Shlomo's generosity. We're going to share with you the first chapter of the new book, The Leadership Operating System. So you'll receive that complimentary after the webinar. With that, I'm going to hand back to Shlomo for some closing words.
Yeah, so what can I say after sort of like an hour of sort of like speaking to a screen? I mean, is that first of all that I missed you guys. I mean, and sort of like looking at the many names on the chat. I mean, I see some names that I've met before and I've worked very closely with before. You're all over the world. I mean, and I miss you tremendously. I mean, and would love to see you on IMD's beautiful campus that is behind me here. And we're hoping, and I think I can speak for Susan and I to say that we're missing those, not just on programs that we teach in, but just getting the buzz back. We're very excited about our MBAs coming back on campus, I mean, on Monday. And I would just say that moving from crisis to recovery, actions matter more than pre-crisis factors. So it is your action that makes the difference. The winners focus on efficiency, evolution, and empowerment. So try to remember these 3 E's as you go back to your operation. And please try to remember that it's not just the what, but it's the how. And high performance leaders are needing and in need to focus on building a great operating system with high levels of trust, clarity, and momentum. Thank you very much for having been with us today. And we're looking forward to seeing you with IMD, whether on screen or in face-to-face. Thank you very much.